Some people have been thinking Dr. Ratio will be subpar because he's free, but that is far from the truth. Dr. Ratio is a solid imaginary single target DPS that's also a follow-up attack engine for units like Topaz. There's also rumbling happening within the theory crafting community that his single target damage is off the chart, even when compared to the rest of the cast. This video will tackle Dr. Ratio's best light cones, Relics, Teambuilding, and Eidolons from an F2P perspective. I've laid out the chapters so you can skip ahead to the part that you need to hear most. Kit Breakdown. His kit revolves around his talent. It states that when he uses his skill, there's a 40% chance he hits with a follow-up attack, and the chance increases by 20% for each debuff that the enemy has. To sum it up, you'll want to put 3 debuffs on your enemy, and Dr. Ratio's follow-up attack will be guaranteed. This is his main source of damage because his skill's motion value is quite smaller in comparison. To add onto the debuff theme, his A2 and A6 traits give him crit rate, crit damage, and damage percent, while his A4 trace gives his skill effect rest shred, which allows units to land their debuffs easier. His ultimate is a single target nuke that applies Wise Man's Folly against his target. When allies attack the target with Wise Man's Folly, Dr. Ratio's talent will proc, and this can proc up to 2 times per use of his ultimate. Overall, he gives off a focus fire type vibe, and I can easily see him being a boss or elite killer. Dr. Ratio currently has the highest base attack in the game, with an astounding 776, and his defensive stats are nothing to scoff at either. He's currently the tankiest hunt character, so I don't think you're going to have too much struggles with him getting one-shot. Rotation. Dr. Ratio's follow-up attacks are triggered by his skill, and those follow-up attacks are his biggest source of damage. This means that he will always want to skill every turn, and thus cannot be a sub-DPS. His follow-up attacks also generate energy, so his rotations will dwindle between a 4-turn or a 5-turn rotation. To be able to solidify his rotations, you need to land those debuffs. Light Cones. His signature light cone is Baptism of Pure Thought, and it's also his best light cone. It increases his crit damage and increases it even further if his enemies are debuffed. When he uses his ultimate, he buffs himself and gives himself damage percent. His follow-up attacks will also gain 24% def ignore for 2 turns. The fact that it gives you a wide variety of stats makes this a great light cone, and I heavily recommend you pick it up for him if possible. His next best light cone is Worrisome Blissful, which is Topaz's light cone. It's more of a supportive cone, and if you've already pulled Topaz, you should probably just put it on her, and Dr. Ratio on something else. After all, if you're running them together, Dr. Ratio will be the main carry. And finally, the fallback option is S5 Cruising in the Stellar Sea. It's F2P and everyone can get it from the Herta shop. Hunt is kind of a mid-path, so I doubt it would be used by any other unit. If Topaz or Sila's using it, it's about time you pull for a signature light cone anyway. The 4-star options are Only Silence Remains and Swordplay. Swordplay can be great if you're in pure single target scenarios, but I highly doubt that they see too much value due to the current content in MOC and pure fiction. Relics. His best relic is the Imaginary set. It gives him free crit stats and even more when an enemy is imprisoned. If you're running Welt, this should be what you're running. His next choice is running 2-piece Imaginary and 2-piece Attack. Quantum set is lagging quite far this time around, but it becomes better than 4-piece Imaginary if the enemy is already weak to Quantum and if you have Pela or Silverwolf on the team. But I recommend that you hold off farming his relics until Penacony is released. Each new region gets a new batch of relics, so there's a chance that there will be a dedicated set for him there. For his planar set, Glamoth is the best if you can hit that 135 speed, and if you lack damage percent. The next best relic set is SSS, because Ratio really lacks attack percent, and it's around even with Inert Cell Soto. Inert Cell Soto is good since it gives him crit and damage percent on his follow-up attacks. For his main stats, you should go crit on his chest, speed on his boots, attack percent or damage percent on his sphere, and attack percent on his rope. You should only take attack percent if your team has an overabundance of attack percent already. For his substats, you should aim for as much crit, attack percent, and speed as possible. But you should make sure that your debuffers are still faster than Dr. Ratio so that they can apply it first. Keep your crit ratio a 1 to 2, and remember that 134 speed isn't a requirement. The only thing that's special about Dr. Ratio is that he might want to have around 42 to 67% EHR to land his debuff from his A4 trace. The debuff shreds the enemy's effect rest, which makes other units' EHR requirements lower. The significance of this is that this counts as 1 debuff for the 3 debuff threshold for consistent follow-up attacks, so you should only consider raising it to such a degree if your team relies heavily on Doctor Ratio to hit that threshold himself, which is not recommended. Don't build EHR on him unless you have a specific reason. Team building. First off, if you're playing Doctor Ratio, make sure that you always have at least 3 sources of consistent debuffs so that Doctor Ratio can guarantee his follow-up attacks, and if you want to maximize his traces, then you should have 5 or 6. Topaz is amazing for Dr. Ratio. She can serve as a sub DPS form, and since Ratio does a follow-up attack almost every turn, they combo well off one another. Finally, we have a consistent engine for the Topaz train. Not only that, but her proof of death from her skill, the Tame Mark from her light cone, and the debtor state from her E1 all count as a debuff. So if you have all of them, you already meet Dr. Ratio's 3 debuff threshold. And the best part? You don't have to run any EHR on Topaz. It's all guaranteed. Welt has great synergy with Dr. Ratio as he applies slows and imprisons, and he enables the imaginary set well. Welt will serve as a sub DPS and occasionally give the enemies vulnerability with his ultimate. Bronya as usual is great almost anywhere. Both fast and slow Bronya work decently with Ratio, and the reason why she works well with him despite him being a follow-up character is that his follow-ups happen on his turn, unlike Nubby and Lightning Lord who have their own turns and therefore cannot benefit from Bronya's skill. Ruan Mei is going to be good if you're running Topaz or some sort of double DPS comp. Ruan Mei's main value is that team-wide damage percent buff, that break efficiency, so you need to capitalize on those through breakers and sub DPSs if you're using her. Pela and Silverwolf are great with Dr. Ratio because they both have Death Shred, which goes nicely with both his Light Cone and the Quantum set. Pela can apply 2 instances of AoE debuffs with Resolution and her ultimate, while Silverwolf can easily apply 6 debuffs on her own. I highly recommend you have at least one of these units if you're in dire need of debuffs. Tingyun is the best F2P Harmony option, and she's great with Dr. Ratio as she allows him to have a 3-turn rotation with her ult, and she gives him loads of stats while being SP positive. Even though she doesn't have debuffs, she's just too valuable to pass up. For sustainers, anyone will suffice. However, I think he has the best synergy with either Huohuo or Locha. Running Locha with 161 speed and multiplication allows him to basic spam and generate a ton of SP for Dr. Ratio's teams, which will be helpful if you're running him with Bronya or Topaz, since they're very SP hungry. Huohuo, on the other hand, has her ultimate that gives Dr. Ratio's entire team a decent amount of energy and attack percent. For a sample F2P team, I'd run Tingyun, Pela, and any sustain. For a premium team, I'd run Dr. Ratio, Topaz, Ruan Mei or Bronya, and Locha or Huohuo. Eidolons. For the question of E1 versus S1, the answer is S1. The stats that its Light Cone gives, alongside its effect, is way more potent than his E1. His E1 essentially increases his crit rate by 10% and his crit damage by 20%. E2 increases his talent's motion value by 20% for every debuff that's on his enemy, to a maximum of 80% extra MV. His E4 makes it so that his follow-up attacks give him a total 20 energy, which cuts his rotations to a consistent 3-turn, and he can even reach a 2-turn with Tingyun. His E6 gives his ultimate 1 more proc and his talent's damage percent by 50%. Nothing too broken, honestly. If I were an F2P Huohuo player, I'd get his S1 and invest in getting Topaz and her Light Cone on her rerun. Getting more Eidolons for him is just overkill, since his single target damage is more than enough. Conclusion: Dr. Ratio's single target damage is a force to be reckoned with, and the fact that Topaz enables him quite well and his follow-up attacks enable Nubby is amazing. I'm sure that combo will be awesome in content that requires focused firing onto one target. Since Pure Fiction was made for AoE units, here's to hoping they'll release a new game mode specifically for boss hunting. However, his weakness is the same weakness that most hunt characters share, and it's that they can't clear waves well. This problem is doubly so with Dr. Ratio because you have to set up enemies with debuffs and when those enemies die, you'd have to set them up all over again. At least when he one-shots a mob with his skill, the follow-up transfers, so it's not as bad as the others. I'd put him individually at A tier, but if you're running Topaz alongside him, that knocks them both up to an A+ tier, since I think they're the absolute best at their niche. Just to remind you, I rated Topaz at around B+ tier on release date. I'm already running Hyper Carry Weld for imaginary damage coverage, so I most likely won't be building Dr. Ratio until I really have to. But for any account that doesn't have any imaginary units, you should definitely upgrade and use him. Pinion and Pela is a very accessible team, and he's still solid alongside them. If you found this video helpful, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps my channel out. If you're still confused about something, leave a comment below and I'll be sure to respond to it. Also, that's it for me. My name is Kyte, and thanks for watching. See ya!